AI safety and bias mitigation are incredibly urgent challenges, and they're also really complex problems to solve. For ZDNET, I'm Dan Patterson, and Lama Nachman is the director of the Intelligent Systems Research Lab at Intel Labs, and she says that if we don't solve these problems now, we're creating bigger and more complex challenges in the future. Now, she says, is the time to solve AI bias. But how? Well, you gotta watch to find out. Your work focuses on amplifying human potential with artificial intelligence and responsible human and AI collaboration. That's so key, especially now in these times of kind of AI hyperbole. There is a real center to, or a real foundation to a lot of what's happening in today's generative AI. But I wonder if you can, maybe we can kind of start there at the foundation. You can kind of help me understand the core of your work and really how your work aids this amplification or this collaboration between humans and AIs.
Basically, our lab, which is the Intelligent Systems Research Lab, is really a multidisciplinary lab that brings social science, design, and AI. So typically, what we're really trying to do is to go into the places that people are doing work, that they are learning, etc., and try to understand how can a human AI system come together to help support people as they are performing different tasks, learning, etc. So I'll give you an example. If you look at some of the work that we do in manufacturing, as an example, right? If you go into manufacturing sites, you have a lot of automation, but you have a lot of people performing all sorts of different tasks, right? Maintenance, assembly, checking different things, validating data, all sorts of things that make sure that these manufacturing facilities are actually working as they should. And there is a lot of pressure on people doing that work because, any type of problems or errors that they make, will result in, ramifications downstream, impacting yield, whatever it might be. So we go in and we kind of look at how people are performing that work and then look for where can an AI system can come in and help support them. So, to be able to do that, though, there is kind of two parts to this, right? It needs to be able to understand what's actually happening in the physical environment as somebody, for example, is doing that assembly task, right? It needs to be able to understand, these are specific tasks, right, that have multiple actions and sub-actions and, a continuous support stream of things, right, that people will acquire those. This is not open dialogue. So, as you're going through all of these documents and collateral from all of this information, you need to be able to start to build that model of what work actually needs to happen and what does it look like in the physical world, right? So you need to understand what's happening visually, you need to understand what's happening in these documents and specs, and then automatically start to build these models. Because if you were going to do it in a way where you just, have to train all of this data to understand action recognition and to understand what all these things are, it's very cost prohibitive. And that's really where, this notion of the human is helping the AI system learn what these things look like. And the AI system is helping support the human, flagging errors, understanding what they're doing in the moment visually, and then having a shared dialogue in the context of that visual scene, as an example.
That is a fascinating process. How would a business or an organization rather go about assessing their needs and finding the right systems, then deploying those systems? It seems like a pretty complex chain. And like you said, it can be cost prohibitive.
It's a very complex chain. And this is why we always start with the ethnographic research, right? So we go and work with people in their workflows and understand, where is the opportunity for the AI system to come and help. The key difference in what we're trying to do is that we're assuming that the AI system is learning from the domain expert, not from the AI developer, right? So as a result, there are a lot of different things that need to happen, right? One is the person who's teaching the AI system isn't someone who understands how to program an AI system, right? So they're actually demonstrating things to the AI system. They give, think aloud hints, things like that. And the system can automatically then go and build these action recognition models, these dialogue models, etc. And I think that changes the cost prohibitive aspect of this, because the system can then continue to iterate as it's working with the user and continue to improve in that context.
And I assume that improvement is kind of recursive, like as it interacts with the domain expert, it learns from that expertise, kind of guided then by this other AI expert.
Yeah, so it's actually, it is iterative, right? So as it sees a person, so just imagine somebody who's doing, as I mentioned, that assembly task, right? The person would be doing the assembly task. The system has already gone through the spec, understood what are all the semantic frames, the actions, the sub actions, etc. It sees the person doing the thing. This is the bootstrapping part, right? So as the person is explaining what they're doing, it's actually now helping fuse what it's seeing visually with what it understands these things are over multiple examples, right? And then start to actually build that action recognition system. Now, as somebody starts to do this after you've bootstrapped the system, if you see something that you're confused about as an AI system, you can actually ask the user, right? So you can continue to then improve that system as the person is doing this. What's really interesting, and part of what I'm actually quite excited about, is this notion of facilitating human to human learning. Because the fact that the AI system is able to observe a lot of different people as they do this, right? It can start to also learn, from experts and help support novices. It can start to see where people deviate in the way that they do things and for what reason, right? And like even facilitate things like changing specs, because people have figured out how to do things differently than maybe what has been perceived in the spec, as an example.
What I'm trying to figure out is the distance between these AI systems that you're describing and kind of the modern generative AI that is rolled out to consumers and businesses, ChatGPT and Google's Bard system. I How alike or not alike are these types of systems?
Yeah, so I mean, if you think about, I mean, there are aspects of this that you could absolutely leverage from a lot of the improvement that has happened, right? So dialogue, for example, like what you get out of generative models today, given the fact that it has learned over all of this input, is really good dialogue systems, as an example, right? But you have the dialogue system in say, a chat GPT, as well as a lot of different content that you can get from everything that's out there, right? The knowledge of what exists in specs, and then how that translates to actually the variability of how people perform tasks in the real world. That's like kind of a huge step in a different direction, right? So it's like, there are parts that you can absolutely leverage from the generic aspect of dialogue, but there are a lot of things in terms of just, the specificity of how people perform things in the physical world that isn't similar to what you would do in a chat GPT. And I think that
Yeah.
is really what's interesting here, right? Because it's, the fact that you have tons of data all over the internet that doesn't require a ground truth associated with it is what really enabled the massive, training of these systems and the ability of these systems to get really good, right? But that doesn't necessarily translate directly to what we're talking about in physical environment and what people do.
Right. And I would imagine there's a bespoke quality to these systems, especially if they're trained on proprietary data. I wonder if we can zoom out just a little bit and maybe you can put into perspective. There have been a number of AI winters and then some cooling periods, but now it seems like it's not just a hot summer. This is the hottest AI has been in a long time. Can you contextualize the developments that you're talking about right now that sound complex but incredibly useful with the history of where we're at in AI? Is this is this really good and really new, or is this just a cycle that will repeat itself over and over?
There's no question that if you look at the massive scale by which we're able to train these systems and how general they seem in what they have learned, right? This is actually like totally transformational in terms of what it can enable for people to actually support them in performing all sorts of different things, right? And in the way that much of that knowledge is incorporated in textual data or that have obvious objective functions that can be easily used to continue to improve the performance of these systems, I think these today seem like they're solvable problems, right? And they're solvable problems not because we figured out how to generalize, it's because we have so much data across so many different domains that make it look like it's actually general. Where does this not actually fit what's actually happening in the real world, right? It doesn't fit when you're actually talking about the physicality of the world, right? The things that are not easily captured in the data that you can go and get from the internet, and understanding, predicting the next word, which actually enables you to do a lot of different things because there is no ground truth that's extra that you actually are assuming you would need to annotate, right? So in a lot of the other places where these things don't apply, that's where you actually don't see that type of scale. So I would say that's actually one of the things. The second thing that I would say is we have figured out how to do this from a generative AI perspective with sheer force, right? I mean, if we think about how in general we do things in the world, we tend to think about things like cost of ownership and, the amount of cost that it takes to train these models and all of that stuff. But today, what we're excited about is what is actually possible, right? So we're training these unbelievably large models, trying to just show what is the capacity of these models to learn, what kind of connections can it make across this data. But if you actually think about where that would need to go next, right? There are a lot of things in the world in terms of like cost to train, sustainability of these models, right? How easily can you actually make sense out of what it's actually doing? A lot of these things don't just go away, right? Those are still constraints that exist. But right now, we're not concerned per se with these because we're trying to just understand what is actually possible. So, so I would say that, it's amazing what they have been able to accomplish, but we definitely are already actually seeing trends to go towards even like, okay, can we make these things, more targeted, smaller, more sustainable, right? Not hallucinating, like all of these different aspects of them that really need to be addressed.
That leads me to other parts of your work, which is how do we address these systems, these challenges? I won't say problems, I know that's a euphemism, but they're challenges. How do we address them responsibly, and how do we continue to train new AI systems responsibly? I know that word is loaded in and of itself, but this is your area of expertise. So first of all, how do we define responsible, and then how do we solve those problems responsibly?
Maybe at a 10,000 foot view level, maybe one way to think about responsibility is alignment to human values. Right? So at the 10,000 foot level, right? If you start to then look at, well, when we think about responsible AI, what are the different areas that people have looked at, right? It's trust, it's accountability, it's transparency, explainability, all of these different aspects that we kind of then map from that lens to say, okay, well, these are the things that are important. But, at the 10,000 foot view level, it's really that alignment. So, I would say, so the way we kind of think about responsible AI is to think about it from a risk-based approach, right? So you look at systems and you ask the questions of what risks come up through these different lenses that I just talked about, and then what are risk mitigation strategies that you need to put, in place as you're developing these systems, right? So if you look at it from a bias perspective, you'd say, okay, well, is this model likely to, bring bias, and at what attributes are you worried about that bias, right? Is it gender? Is it race, et cetera, et cetera? And then you start to actually do all of the analysis to make sure that the system that you're putting out isn't biased. Now, I would say that if I step back for a bit and look at the progression over maybe the last 6-7 years or so in responsible AI, right? Those are so the focus has really been on, okay, well, what do we need to do from a governance standpoint, right? How do we ensure that things that companies are developing internally, they're actually developing responsibly throughout these lenses and doing quantitative analysis, bringing multidisciplinary teams together, putting boards, blah, 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 whatever. So that's been kind of something that's been progressing for the last 6-7 years. I think there is, and those risks in some sense understood, but many of them are really hard to solve for, right? And some of this is still in research realm. Some is we've made actually really good progress on. And I can dig deeper into these details. But I would say that more recently, we started to see a second set of risk that doesn't look like what we've been talking about over the last 7 years, right? And if you look at, for example, the open letter recently or the AI statement, right, there is a different set of risks that people are identifying, which is there like an existential threat that's actually happening, right? And part of that is because people are being surprised by the capability of these models and what they're doing. And because there are all of these agents that you can actually unleash to go learn based on some objective function, right? And have some way of automating actions in the world because of the digital world and what it can do. So as a result, you're seeing people shift their opinion more recently about how close is this existential threat, and does that really need to wait for general intelligence to come in, or is this version of what we have, along with automation that is already available, capable of actually creating these existential threats? And I think that's an absolutely valid thing, because we are actually getting surprised by what these models are. Even though they're not general AI, they're actually able to do a lot of things that are actually quite problematic. I think, to me, sometimes I think the most problematic part of that puzzle is actually the human in the center of this. And this is where I think misinformation is something that I worry about so deeply, right? Because you don't even need to automate action in the world, right? All you need to do is influence people that then can go take action, right? And I think if the human is at the center of this, and you're actually, having a lot of misinformation there, and you're manipulating people to do things, then that is also a very worrisome situation that we're actually in. And that's partly maybe why we tried to focus on some of the work on like trusted media and misinformation, and being able to utilize AI to figure out when there is actually like misinformation and fake media and all of that stuff, because that's actually one of the things that really worry me deeply and timely right now, not necessarily in what we're hypothesizing could happen in the future.
I'm so glad that you brought up misinformation, especially about the realities of what is happening right now. I usually try to end each one of these conversations with a question about the practicality of the future of artificial intelligence, but you've already answered that along with a number of your fears, which are playing out right now. I wonder if you could forecast maybe the next short term 6, 12, 18, even 36 months into the future. It sounds like misinformation is a huge concern, but how do we control adversarial uses of these technologies? Even if we regulate, our adversaries won't have the same goals. So this is a diplomatic challenge, it's a technological challenge, it's certainly, like you noted, a human challenge. How do we approach this? Is a big problem. How do we solve it? Is there a solution?
I mean, it's a huge problem, right? And this is why, I mean, in some sense, the reason I constantly think about misinformation is that as humans, we have a tendency to believe what we see in visual form, in video form, right? I mean, when we hear somebody say something and we see this person saying something, then we are much more likely to believe that. And if generative AI, and it is today here, is able to actually fool a human in believing what's real and what's fake, right? That to me is something that's extremely worrisome about what it can actually enable in the world to happen. So yes, I mean, regulation, there is no question about regulation being something that's needed, because for people who actually develop technologies, it's very hard for people who develop technologies to ensure that technology isn't going to get misused, right? So the only thing, there's a lot that you can do in terms of responsible development, but misuse can only be, handled by really governance and regulation. It's very hard to actually handle misuse in any other way. In terms of, misinformation, I think it's a race, right? So it's a question of how do you continue to enable people with tools that can help them at a time when they can't trust necessarily what it is that they're seeing with their own eyes, right? So a lot of the, part of that race is how do you turn AI to help support you in discovering where AI is actually being used to generate all of that fake content. And there is a race, but you can over time start to rely on many, many different signals of human authenticity that can actually give you more information that can help you diagnose what might be, real versus fake. So in my mind, a big part of that puzzle is how do you empower people with the right tools to actually give them an ability to actually fight against that, right? So, governance needs to happen, but how do you enable people with research and tools that actually can empower them?
For ZDNet, I'm Dan Patterson, and for more interviews like this one, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and to keep up with the latest in emerging technology innovation, visit ZDNet.com.